The heroine had already read quite a lot of books about this world, and also often communicated with her maids, but the best way to gather information was still tea drinking, which the girl understood perfectly well. So, although with some apprehension, Miss decided to accept this strange invitation. Therefore, on the appointed day and at the appointed time, the heroine arrived at the event that she had organized. This time, Miss chose a more flashy red outfit, in which she smiled slightly at everyone. This was Ria's first time meeting people outside the palace, so she was serious. The lady almost immediately guessed that Salomona, because of her title, was the most influential at this tea party. So, the heroine set herself the task of finding out as much as possible about the Duchess, and for now, she sat down at the table. Suddenly, the woman noticed that the first Empress had a beautiful and amazing dress. At this, the Duchess smiled sweetly, as if nothing had happened, and looked straight into the guest's eyes. This immediately made it clear to Rebellia that they were clearly not on friendly terms with the organizer of the meeting, since it was considered bad form among the nobility for someone to evaluate someone else's wealth or beauty. They tried to avoid these topics, but for some reason, Salomon calmly raised such topics, and her smile never left her face. So, the lady realized that the woman, out of envy, actually considered only the dress beautiful, but not her. Fortunately, it was not at all difficult for Rebellia to ignore such petty attacks directed at her, especially because their table was located at some distance from the rest of the guests, so no one heard almost anything. However, it remained a mystery to the lady why no one respected her, since she had been an empress for a long time. Judging by the Duchess's behavior, she was not the only one who believed that Rebellia was unworthy of aristocratic society. Only the previous lady was no longer there, and in her place was a heroine who was not going to tolerate this. Miss suddenly announced that she bought her dress from the most popular designer, Winston Mystic. The emperor's first wife specifically boasted that the man offered her so many options for outfits that it was difficult for her to choose. So, the lady complained about her hard life because it was not easy for her to achieve this beautiful image. Salomona did not expect that the empress would humiliate her by pointing out that the Duchess herself did not have such choices. To save face, the woman said that she needed to monitor the event and left. The heroine was very pleased that she had managed to watch the back of the retreating lady. Rebellia understood perfectly well that if the Duchess had remained sitting next to her, she would have lost her dignity. However, there was still an empty seat at the table next to the lady, which made her wonder who would sit there. Suddenly, a concubine came down the steps into the hall, cheerfully and sweetly asking for forgiveness for being late. The noble ladies immediately greeted her with joy and replied that everything was in order, so she could sit down. The heroine practically didn't pay attention to the next noise that Aisha had specially created. It was only when the girl walked right up to her desk and said hello that Miss finally raised her head and looked at her. Only now, having analyzed the situation with the arrival of the second wife, the heroine realized that all the people around her were trying to ignore her. According to etiquette, if a person with a higher status is sitting at the table, then everyone else does not have the right to stand up. It was a way of showing politeness to the nobility, who might feel awkward being left alone. However, when Aisha appeared in the hall, all the people stood up from the table where Rebellia was sitting. The concubine herself smiled completely innocently since she was not guilty of such an attitude towards the first wife. The aristocrats around them continued to praise the beauty of the second wife, who had arrived a little later, almost without stopping. From this, the lady drew a conclusion and guessed why Salomona had invited her to tea in the first place. With this, the cunning Duchess wanted to increase the influence of the concubine in the eyes of the public and the guests of the event. So, she turned to the second wife directly and asked if she had anything she wanted to tell her, which Aisha did not expect. However, the Empress realized that her plot had been exposed, so she also asked Rebellia for forgiveness. The girl said that she had not been in the empire for long, so she was not used to the local manners, but she would be more careful. The heroine didn't need these empty excuses from the lady because they only irritated her. The first empress quickly noticed how much the concubine's hands were trembling from fear and worry. Therefore, the lady decided not to put even more pressure on the stupid girl, who did not expect that she would have to bow down before her rival. At this point, Rebellia rose to leave and asked everyone present to watch their behavior around her. The ladies, who were essentially reprimanded, felt awkward because they had really done something wrong. But the one who felt worse now was the concubine, who had expected a completely different ending to the evening. The girl reported everything to the emperor, but he asked in response whether she couldn't handle such matters herself. The second empress did not expect such an answer, so she stupidly asked him again what he meant, and he froze in place. Alex then explained that since he was the ruler, he had no right to interfere in the affairs between the wives. Hearing this, Aisha made a sad face and began to say that she had upset the emperor too much. The guys sighed and immediately informed the lady that she had not upset him in any way, so everything was fine. However, the concubine did not stop there and continued to sadly tell how busy her husband was. When the miss mentioned his busyness, the ruler became angry because, understanding all this, the girl continued to distract him. He asked Aisha what he should do, and the concubine smiled through her fingers, as that was what she wanted. The second empress, for the sake of decency, said that it was too presumptuous for her to speak of her concerns. However, she admitted that she heard the ladies insulting Rebellia after tea, which did not please the emperor. The concubine then added that the first empress's behavior was indeed out of the ordinary, so she asked the ruler to personally talk to the lady to make her behave well. At the end, Aisha hinted that the guy was, after all, Rebellia's husband, and his task was to keep her in hand. The emperor did not expect that the concubine would ask him for such a favor, hiding behind the fact that his wife would listen. In the end, after finishing the conversation with the concubine, Alex still decided to visit the room of the first empress. The guy was serious because the concubine's words still worried him to some extent. However, with a sad smile, he was forced to admit to himself that Aisha had not lived up to his expectations at all. The emperor remembered the lady's face as she spoke to him, and he understood that the lady was not as naive as she wanted to appear. The girl constantly spoke in a veiled manner, but eventually voiced her true intentions. The ruler easily guessed that his second wife would like him to deal with Rebellia personally. Only now did he realize that this was not the first time Aisha had persuaded people like this, which meant there was no good nature in her. The emperor finally realized that the concubine was actually exactly the same as himself. The supposedly sweet and innocent girl was just hiding behind this kind mask, but inside she was cunning and evil. The ruler knew that if he were kind and naive, upon learning about the lady's nature, he would immediately hate her. However, even now, the concubine was still more useful to him than disgusting, so the guy was going to leave her. In the meantime, all of Alex's thoughts were directed in a different direction as he knocked on Rebellia's door. She immediately opened it. Since it was already late, the girl was dressed in her sleeping clothes and was clearly unhappy that someone had come to see her. Seeing the emperor, the heroine calmed down a little and asked what brought him to her in the middle of the night. To this, the ruler asked quite seriously whether he could enter his own wife's chambers. The lady would have liked not to let the guy in, but she still couldn't refuse him as curiosity got the better of her. When the miss stepped aside, allowing him to pass, the emperor thanked her with a smile. He looked around because he suddenly realized that he hadn't been here for over a month. While Alex was looking at everything thoughtfully, the girl demanded that he answer what he needed. What angered the lady most was that the emperor had avoided her for a long time, and now came in the middle of the night. To this, the ruler smiled sweetly and said that the spouses did not necessarily have to have a reason to meet. Rebellia was surprised by what she heard, but she did not really believe the words of her completely unloved husband. She couldn't understand how the emperor could say something like that to her after the divorce announcements. While the heroine was angry, the ruler was looking closely at her face, as he was very interested. The guy noticed that the girl's expression had somehow changed and seemed to become much more lively. After all, before, for some reason, she was always very anxious, nervous, and even gloomy in appearance. But now Rebellia showed a much wider range of emotions, which fascinated the guy. At first, Alex thought that the lady was trying to attract attention, but a little later he realized that this was not the case. For the emperor, his first wife seemed to have become a completely different person for some reason, and now he liked the empress much more, because she had become much more demanding than before. So right now, the ruler honestly admitted to the lady that he would never have thought that she could be like this. Alex said that he had been with the girl for 3 years already, and each time she opened up to him from a new side. The heroine listened to the guy with surprise because she did not expect him to talk about something like that. Then the emperor complimented the girl's outfit, which surprised her even more because this was not something to talk about at night. So the lady said that she wanted to sleep, so if the ruler had nothing to say, she would see him out. Hearing such a daring remark, His Majesty did not get angry, but was amused by it. He said to Mrs. Sherd back that he definitely really liked the way she had somehow ended up becoming. To this, Rebellia replied that she had not changed for the sake of the emperor, but only for herself. The ruler remembered that the lady wanted a divorce, so he nodded and repeated again that he simply liked her new style. These words already made an impression on the heroine because she turned around and became a little embarrassed. The girl herself did not understand why she suddenly felt as if she had butterflies in her stomach. The Empress's state did not escape the notice of the emperor because he was standing quite close to her, so the guy, clearly laughing at the lady, specifically asked why she suddenly blushed. But Rebellia had nothing to answer such a question. So, even more embarrassed, the miss only turned away. In the end, the heroine came up with something to answer and said that it was just that the lighting in her room was so strange. The emperor listened silently to the lady's tales about how it was precisely because of the special lighting that her face appeared red. Afterwards, he smiled but did not ask any more questions so as not to embarrass the girl even more. Suddenly, the ruler realized that he was having fun, but he didn't think he would get so carried away. The guy remembered very well that he had not been so interested in watching other people all this time. However, recently, for some reason, the ruler increasingly liked the reactions of his first wife. This was all because before the lady looked more like an obedient puppet than a living person. Only now, after all these thoughts, Alex said that he came because of the incident at the recent evening dinner. Rebellia remembered very well exactly how she had treated Mayor's Wilhelm, and she did not regret it at all. The emperor reported that such behavior of the miss caused him a fair amount of trouble. But then, to the girl's great surprise, the ruler said that he wanted to thank her for her help with the Maris. Rebellia did not know that the emperor himself was also planning to somehow get rid of Wilhelm. Alex reported that the man was involved in many illegal activities to increase his financial status. The ruler was never able to track down all of the Maris's sources of income, but in any case, he did not like such people. Miss did not expect that her husband himself hired a killer, although only to intimidate Wilhelm. The guy once again thanked the Empress for getting ahead of him and dealing with the man herself. He explained that as emperor, he had no right to interfere in something like that. But Rebellia already had that right. Nevertheless, the heroine understood that she still attracted a lot of attention with her prank. Therefore, she did not understand how she could only help the emperor if she tried to make things worse. Alex then explained that the incident at the event was reported in many newspapers the next day, and now the ruler was happy that this gave him the opportunity to send a delegation to the mayor's estate to investigate all his illegal activities. The heroine did not know that Wilhelm was such a bad person because she herself beat him for a different reason. The emperor knew perfectly well about his wife's motives because everyone knew about the man's adventures, but the ruler did not expect that the empress herself would personally decide to stand up for her subjects. Unexpectedly, the guy told the girl that they could be quite good partners in such matters. Alex knew that few would expect the husband and wife to work together, since the rumors about their relationship were bad. But Rebellia responded by saying that she didn't want to have anything to do with someone she was planning to divorce. Later, these words angered the emperor enough that he stared at the lady in silence for a while, but then he said that he couldn't go against her now, which ultimately surprised the heroine greatly. Then the ruler explained that in the future he was even going to change just to get her. These words only caused further rejection in Rebellia, since she did not believe the guy. The lady stated that His Majesty only said this because he simply does not know how to lose properly. So a dispute arose between the husband and wife about which of them would ultimately win over the other. And the heroine said that the emperor should start to be afraid of her because her teeth were very sharp. Suddenly, the guy felt that for some reason he wanted to touch the girl after her words. In the end, he couldn't hold back and extended his hand, feeling the warmth of the lady's skin with his fingers. The emperor realized once and for all that he really wanted the empress to be completely his. Moreover, for some reason, the ruler now constantly desired more from communication with his first wife. So the guy approached the girl, because he couldn't stand it any longer, and waited to kiss her. The emperor still did not understand where such a strong desire for intimacy with her came from. It was the first time in his life that the ruler had ever felt anything like this, so he had difficulty accepting his emotions. Meanwhile, the lady's wide eyes, pink cheeks, and slightly parted lips only attracted him more. However, the guy tried to come to his senses, because he was worried about how Rebellia would react if he confessed his desire to her. However, these mental orders had no effect on the ruler, so he moved even closer to the miss. As a result, their lips almost touched each other, and there were only a couple of centimeters left before the kiss. But the long-awaited merger never happened, because the heroine suddenly woke up and unexpectedly hit her husband hard with a pillow. The emperor could not even imagine that he would be interrupted in such a sudden way, so he missed the blow, and the empress herself blushed so much because of the situation that had just happened that she could hardly speak. Only after a few seconds did the girl catch her breath and was able to ask if the guy had gone crazy. She lifted the pillow up again and swung it, screaming that they were about to get divorced and that Alex was getting violent. His Majesty barely managed to dodge the blows and at the same time asked the miss to finally calm down. But Rebellia had just experienced such strong emotions that she could not come to her senses. Only when the lady showed the emperor the door did she finally fall silent. But he didn't understand anything. When her husband was outside the room, still emotional, the heroine threw the pillow back onto the bed. Rebellia was still very red, and her heart continued to beat at an accelerated pace due to excitement, and the miss herself considered such an act of the ruler to be very low because they were soon to get divorced. The girl put her fingers to her lips, because for some reason she couldn't get the attempted kiss out of her head. Only a few moments later did she come to her senses and order herself to forbid herself from remembering anything like that at all. Almost falling asleep, Miss convinced herself that Alex had not been honest with her, so it was better to forget about the failed kiss. The heroine remembered perfectly well that during all 3 years, the emperor never even looked at Rebellia, so she did not believe that the ruler suddenly for some reason became interested in the first empress. As a result, the girl was unable to sleep normally because of the thoughts that were creeping into her head. She rightly blamed the emperor for this state of hers, who made her nervous. Just in case, that same morning, Miss looked through the laws to find one that would provide for punishment for beating a ruler. However, even without finding anything in the law, the heroine was still unable to calm down completely, and therefore was still agitated. However, Rebellia also remembered that she now had other concerns related to palace affairs. It was the empress who managed the support of cultural development in the emperor's palace and beyond. She was also responsible for the financial well-being of the common people, distributing the budget for charity. In fact, Aisha was supposed to do all this too, but she pretended that she knew nothing and lived happily. However, half a year had already passed since the concubine appeared, which began to anger the heroine a little. Besides, she herself had only recently entered this world, but she still carried out these duties. Even the maids began to advise the empress to take a break for a while, since she worked a lot. Hearing this advice from her assistants, the lady turned to them and asked if she really looked tired. It suddenly dawned on the first wife that she was actually a villain and therefore should not have been doing this. At that moment, the concubine was sitting in the company of her confidants and smiling because they were complimenting her. Suddenly, the door to her room swung open with a bang, which ended up scaring the lady a lot. It turned out that Rebellia had burst inside. Although Aisha clearly remembered that she had not called the empress to her, the first wife, obviously angry about something, said that she was busy with her work while the concubine was communicating with the maids. After this, the villainess threw a pile of paper on the girl's table and said that she would now have to sort it all out. With a smile, the first empress said that the concubine had already been sitting idle in the palace for a long time. Only after handing over all her work to Aisha was the lady able to relax peacefully over a cup of tea, which was what she was missing. The concubine was against such happiness in the form of work for her, but Rebellia did not ask the Mrs. opinion. The girl tried her best to prove that she had not yet had time to prepare properly for such work, but the heroine did not agree to tolerate her second wife's absence from work for even a short time. So, she forced her to read the documents. Then Isha tried the last option and asked if the emperor approved of this decision. But Rebellia was ready for such arguments and said that this matter did not concern the ruler. As a result, the concubine began to work, but she did it so badly that destruction began. The lady even managed to somehow send workers to the wrong place and pay someone incorrectly. The palace was always like a mechanism in which everything was interconnected, so soon everything began to fall apart. The servants came to Rebellia and constantly begged her to run things again, as they always had before. The heroine herself suddenly realized that everyone around her took her work for granted and only now realized something, now that Isha's work was threatening to have huge bad consequences. The assistants were very scared. In fact, it was not easy for the lady herself to play the role of a villain who abandoned a lot of people like that. But she misunderstood that if she returned to her work right now, there would be no point in her rebellion. So, the Empress looked menacingly at the servants and declared that she was not going to work anymore. After this, the lady also asked what the concubine was doing since the servants continued to run to her. The assistants looked at each other because the answer to the question was too sad for all of them. They then reported that Aisha's maids were doing everything they could to help her, but it was not enough. The heroine guessed that something like this would happen, but she didn't expect that everything would ultimately get so much worse. However, she still had no intention of working, so she screamed for everyone to go away and leave her alone. As a result, the assistants were able to reach the emperor himself, who came to the Empress. He asked why Rebellia couldn't get back to her job, since he himself didn't have time to do both his own work and keep an eye on Aisha. The first wife herself knew that if she worked in tandem with the concubine, her workload would be significantly reduced. What surprised her most was that Alex spoke respectfully of his second wife, which meant that they were not alone here. The ruler, meanwhile, stated that he had been too inattentive, which had only made the situation worse. The guy said that he was not asking for forgiveness at all, but he would like the lady to at least take some action. The heroine expected her husband to talk about something like this, so she just sighed before starting to speak. Suddenly, Alex said that he had no right to force the lady to work again, which really surprised her. Meanwhile, he said that he was asking the Empress for a favor and not at all ordering her, as one might think. This approach really surprised Rebellia, because she expected anything but such behavior from the guy. Right now, Alex seemed very sincere to the lady, although she didn't care about all his apologies. Most of all, the heroine felt sorry for all those people who were now suffering because of their internal conflicts. So, Rebellia reminded him that the ruler promised to do everything possible to ensure that she did not stop working. After this, the girl asked him to write her a receipt, stating that the emperor would train the concubine and that the duties would be distributed among the wives. To this, Alex seriously replied that he was ready to write such an agreement if that would give him the girl's trust. But the lady said that everything was not so simple, because if the guy did not fulfill his promise, he would be forced to give her a divorce. Gritting his teeth, the emperor agreed to these conditions, since he did not intend to break his promise anyway. Rebellia was noticeably unhappy that the ruler had made things so difficult between them. In any case, Alex kept his promise and assigned 5 excellent teachers to Aisha at once, while the concubine was training the heroine, again had to take on all the responsibilities, which is why she even forgot to play the role of the villain. The lady had barely managed to stabilize the work of the palace again, when the maids told her that many admired her work. All these compliments were heard not only by Rebellia, who was embarrassed by them, but also by Aisha, and she was already angry. However, the spread of rumors was unstoppable, so the assistants continued to communicate. One of them knew a little more than her friends and was not at all against sharing interesting information. The girl reported that the Empress hired 3 new people, one of whom was an officer, the second was responsible for charity, and the third supported culture. The second maid remembered that she had personally complimented Rebellia, and she had reacted in a very unusual way. Then the heroine said that she does her job not at all, so that everyone will praise her. In the end, the assistants could not even imagine such a sweet and polite answer from the shy, as it turned out, lady. The concubine also heard these enthusiastic cries, which only made her angrier, and more anxious. As a result, the lady came up with a plan according to which she invited several important people to a private tea party. The first thing the girl did was to show off all the beautiful flowers that the emperor had given her. The noble ladies were delighted both with the ruler's gift and with the beauty and sweetness of Aisha herself. Among all these people, Count Drap was also invited, who spoke more rudely about the emperor than anyone else. However, the boy noted that the emperor's kindness towards the concubine clearly indicated his love. But, for some reason, this phrase did not particularly please one of the aristocrats, who almost repeated the count's words. Then Drap tried to impress the girls even more with his knowledge, and said that the ruler was very capricious. He even started telling one of the stories to prove it when he suddenly realized that he was saying all this in front of Alex's wife. The girl admitted that she herself noticed how mean her husband could be, so everything was fine. The count was amused when he realized that he had not set people against him, and praised the lady for actively studying politics. But he didn't expect that Miss Aisha would say that she wasn't studying anything special, but simply wanted to be useful in the boorish way. Hearing how the miss was somehow belittling herself, the aristocrats around her began to convince the girl otherwise. It was at this point that Aisha decided to start her game and said that because of all the studying, she was now feeling dizzy. This greatly frightened the noble ladies, who immediately tried to call doctors, but the concubine said that she didn't want to make any unnecessary noise, so there was no need to call anyone. The girl deliberately pretended that it was very difficult for her to provide the assistance that she had to provide to the palace. As a result, the invited guests began to wonder why Rebellia put so much pressure on Aisha. This was exactly what the concubine had been desperately seeking, so she allowed herself to smile a little. The girl then continued to convince everyone around her that she simply wanted to be as educated as her first wife. She listed the tasks that she had now been carefully taught, which only surprised the aristocrats even more. Aisha also reported that the first empress probably paid a lot of money for all her education. The count was the one who was most impressed by the amount of money that Rebellia had given just for the education of her concubine. Being a talkative person, he suddenly began to discuss his second wife's father, who was also a respected man. Drap was so rambling that he didn't immediately notice that no one present supported his words. When the guy finally fell silent, a dissatisfied silence reigned among everyone else for a while. Suddenly, one of the noblewomen changed the subject and said that it would be a good idea to tell the emperor about the situation with the concubine. The count did not immediately understand why the girl had even started talking about something like that in his presence. The thing is that it was Drap who was closest to the emperor, and therefore it was he who could talk to him. However, the guy himself did not want to expose himself so much, so he barely contained his fear. Then his concubine called out to him, and the count immediately turned to her in the hope that she would be able to save him. But the lady suddenly declared that the guy would have helped her a lot if he had talked to the ruler. This put the poor guy in a situation where he could not refuse the responsibility placed upon him. So Drap tried to cheer himself up and enthusiastically said that he would protect the poor Isha. The girl herself, who achieved exactly this result, noted with a smile that it was quite easy. She loved hot young men so much because older aristocrats would not have noticed this trick. But for a young guy who liked the attention of a lady, it was normal to act a little stupidly. So now Aisha was extremely glad that she had planned everything perfectly, and Drap had fallen for her hook. Soon the emperor arranged a meeting between the aristocrats, to which the count was also invited. The only thing is, the guy still doubted whether it was a good idea to implement it this way. However, Drap's manhood did not allow him to ignore what had happened recently at tea time. So the guy worried that many of the aristocrats didn't even know what was going on. Still, he stood up to speak. Moreover, with the information that the count had found, his case was bound to become very hotly debated. He finally and irrevocably began to consider Rebellia a vicious and stupid woman whom the emperor married by mistake. Drap did not understand how the first empress dared to bring her beautiful concubine to tears. So as a person who cared about the fate of the empire, the guy was not going to keep silent about anything. And so, right now, before the ruler began the meeting itself, the count jumped up and said that he had something to say. One of the older aristocrats immediately reminded the boy that he should have asked permission first and then spoken. It was Uncle Drap, but he didn't even turn in his direction because he considered that he was no longer a child to listen to him. He nodded to his allies among the nobility, and they began to spread the report about the concubine Aisha to everyone. Seeing this, the boy's uncle jumped up and began to scold him for doing something without his knowledge. Suddenly, the man was stopped by the emperor himself, something that even Drap, who had expected to be heard, could not have expected. The ruler suddenly said with a smile that he was interested to know what kind of information the guys were able to find. Then the count repeated once again that the first empress had committed too many atrocities, and even to this, Alex responded with a smile and asked the count to tell him in more detail what he meant. Noticing that his majesty was showing interest, the boy decided that this was a good sign while he was reporting. The men who already guessed what would happen next to the count tried to sit silently, and it seemed to Drap himself that all the older aristocrats were probably envious of his courage. The count had already begun to dream that if his merits were recognized, he would even be able to reach the level of his uncle. The guy was greatly encouraged by the fact that the emperor never stopped smiling throughout his report. Suddenly, the ruler asked whether the boy himself thought so, or whether someone had advised him to conduct this investigation. To this, Drap proudly declared that this was his personal opinion on the matter, and that 7 other young aristocrats supported him. Unexpectedly for the guy, Alex suddenly said that it was very good that there were only 7 such idiots. At first, the guy even thought that he imagined it, but the emperor really was not on his side. The count's uncle, who suspected that something like this might happen, only bowed his head sadly. The ruler, meanwhile, asked Drap if he had thought about why the lady had done this, and then asked the secretary to bring some documents. They described in detail why Robelia did this or that strange action, only for the good of the empire. Alex suggested that Drap study the contents of the sheets carefully if the guy even had enough brains for it. The count realized what a terrible situation he had found himself in, but he could no longer do anything to save himself. So with a trembling hand, the boy picked up one of the sheets that the ruler threw to him in order to read it. Anyway, it was written on it that the Marquis was accused of exporting military weapons as well as embezzling taxes, which surprised the count since the ruler scattered the sheets of information in different directions. The other aristocrats picked them up as well. The men had no idea that their colleague was capable of such a thing, while he himself led the life of a good man. Alex, however, stated that the empress had risked her reputation to stop Wilhelm from fleeing the country. Hearing this, Drap realized that all the bad information he had found about Robelia made no sense. Because of this, cold sweat began to flow from the guy's forehead and fall directly onto the document he was holding in his hands. Meanwhile, the emperor recalled what happened in the palace when the concubine ruled it. He explained that at that moment, his first wife realized that it would be unwise for just one person to run everything. Only now did the count realize that Aisha had been trained only to ease the overall burden on the lady. The ruler continued to insist that all of Rebellia's actions were correct, which the count could not argue with. Having finished speaking, Alex said that he didn't even know what to do with the 7 idiots who decided to defame his wife's honor. Drape couldn't have imagined such a turn of events, even in his worst nightmares, because he was counting on a promotion. At that moment, the heroine herself, who had no idea what was being discussed at the meeting, still felt awkward. After the meeting ended, Aisha returned to her room and sighed sadly, sitting down in a chair. Although she used those guys, she still expected a greater result from the protest, which was ultimately useless. At this moment, the girl was distracted from her thoughts by one of the devoted maids, who noticed something. The assistant thought that the lady was more thoughtful than usual, but the concubine herself was surprised when the girl told her about it. Aisha turned away and said that she was perfectly fine, but the maid didn't quite believe it. Then the concubine admitted that she was worried because the emperor had not been coming to see her lately. The assistants themselves noticed this, but did not dare to speak out loud at first. Now they could finally discuss it. Meanwhile, the second wife sadly said that even when the ruler was very busy, he still came to her. Then one of the assistants had an idea and suggested that the lady work as a holy goddess. She began to convince the lady that only she was capable of such a thing because she had greatly changed the life of His Majesty. Upon hearing this, Aisha immediately became happy as she saw additional opportunities before her. The girl thanked her assistant with all her heart for the unexpected but necessary decision. In the novel, There was a time when October was approaching, and all the little birds were starting to build their nests. At this time, the concubine invited all the noble people to her event, where she was going to be the goddess of the new culture. After reading this invitation, the heroine was surprised because, once again, she could not remember anything like this in the novel. She felt that she should have remembered such an event, which meant that neither the letter nor Aisha's evening was in the book. However, Relia didn't expect the concubine to try to get in her way so blatantly. When the lady went out for a walk, she was still thinking about the actions of her second wife, so she did not immediately notice how they approached her. The emperor, who noticed the empress from afar and approached her, smiled kindly at her as a greeting. To this, the girl thought that they had begun to suspiciously often run into each other by accident. This circumstance angered the heroine quite a lot, as she would have just liked to be alone with her thoughts. As a result, after returning from the walk, the lady finally decided to attend the concubine's event. A large number of aristocrats came to the evening, as everyone was interested in what would happen. Aisha herself wore a shorter dress than was allowed in high society, especially for this event. With this, the girl immediately began to attract the attention of men and women from the outside. But this was what she was trying to achieve initially. The concubine was worried whether it was too frivolous of her to wear such a short outfit. The thing is that, according to etiquette, ladies in the empire wear dresses that cover their ankles even in the heat. However, much more than maintaining propriety, Miss wanted to stand out at this celebration, so she resolutely clenched her fist. Aisha was confident that no one present would dare to condemn the empress herself. However, the fact that Relia also agreed to come to her event greatly worried the concubine. The concubine understood perfectly well that it was this lady who most often attracted all the attention to herself, which created problems. The most offensive thing for the second empress was that the first wife somehow even took the ruler for herself. But Aisha herself, for some reason, remained out of work, although the emperor continued to give her various gifts. At the same time, the concubine almost sadly recalled the time when Relia stood out in almost no way. This made the girl bite her beautiful lips out of frustration and anger, since she could not openly show her emotions. However, now the lady put a smile on her face, as she was going to be the center of attention for everyone. Miss happily greeted everyone who agreed to come to her event because it was important to her. Suddenly, Aisha froze in the middle of her speech as she saw something she never expected to notice. Just then, the girl nevertheless tried to restore her speech so that there would be no pauses in her performance in front of the audience of nobility. However, the fact that Relia wore such a revealing red dress did not give the concubine any peace. As a result, many aristocrats looked only in the direction of the magnificently dressed first empress. With horror, Aisha realized that, compared to her first wife, her dress did not stand out at all, and even looked dull. At this moment, noticing that the concubine had somehow fallen silent, Relia spoke up and asked everyone to calm down. The heroine crossed her legs, revealing an even greater view of herself, and with a smile, asked people to return the floor to the hero of the occasion. Although the first wife asked the nobles to behave decently, the concubine still continued to feel uncomfortable. At this point, Relia suddenly and quite sincerely encouraged the girl, inviting her to continue her speech. Aisha didn't expect that her rival would suddenly start paying attention to her and even help her in some way. But these words from the first empress unexpectedly encouraged the second, and she was able to continue the event. Suddenly, she noticed that the emperor was paying attention to his first wife, begging her to cover her legs. The heroine responded sluggishly that she was not cold at all, so she saw no point in fulfilling her husband's requests. But Alex couldn't calm down because Relia's revealing outfit bothered him a lot. Watching their dialogue, Aisha involuntarily cringed, but still ordered herself to relax and think about it later. Once again, the concubine reminded everyone that she was the main one at this event, so she called out to the people and said that she would share with them information from her world. The thing is that Aisha came to this dimension from Korea, where she lived in the ordinary modern world. The heroine also came from Korea, so she understood perfectly well what the telephone was that the concubine was talking about. But the girl herself, for obvious reasons, was not interested in this technical achievement, so she was bored. However, the nobility was very interested in the phone, and no one could believe that this thing even worked. One of the men said that he would gladly acquire such a thing, which ultimately greatly frightened the concubine. Aisha didn't expect this at all, so she even took a few steps back out of fear, and the people around suddenly decided that Miss would be able to get a phone for them and were already happily waiting for this. The concubine didn't think that it would be enough for the aristocrats to just hear stories about her world to avoid further confusion. The second empress admitted that she could not create a telephone. This greatly surprised the nobility because they believed that the whole goddess could do absolutely everything in the world. Then Aisha couldn't take it anymore and shouted that she was an ordinary student, not a scientist or an engineer. The heroine, who also didn't know that something like this would happen, silently watched this whole stupid and sad argument from the side. The girl felt relieved that she hadn't told anyone about herself, because then there would have been questions for her too. Also, the concept of university was very different in this world, and meant that you dedicated most of your life to knowledge and study. Even among the wealthiest aristocrats of this dimension, few were honored to study in such an institution. Rebellia knew that in Korea, university was just a stepping stone in education, which was different from the idea in this world. So now, Aisha was in a panic because to everyone she seemed like a goddess, but in reality, she couldn't do anything here. The heroine glanced toward the emperor and even thought about intervening and helping the concubine. Suddenly, Alex himself gave the command to the lady to stop chatting and give her word to Aisha, which helped the lady. Rebellia was watching the concubine, who was the center of attention, when suddenly she met her eyes. At the same time, the face of the second empress was distorted by the rage that she wanted to direct towards her first wife. The girl believed that it was the heroine who was to blame for her finding herself in such a stupid situation. So she turned to the servants and asked them to quickly bring what they had prepared for everyone in advance. In response, the assistants said that they needed a little more time since the preparations were not finished, but the concubine was not going to wait and feel ashamed for even a few more minutes. So she demanded that everything be taken out immediately. When the servants obeyed, Aisha announced that she had prepared various dishes from her world for the dear guests. This turned out to be a huge surprise for the heroine, because the food in this world was very different from what she ate in her Korea. The aristocrats, meanwhile, were able to examine the prepared food and began to admire it in different ways. Some people liked the appearance of the unusual food, others liked the smell. Although the portions themselves were quite small, Aisha, happy that everyone was listening to her, again announced that people could eat and drink as much as they wanted. The girl was sure that after the meal, everyone would treat her well, but suddenly something went wrong. One after another, noble people suddenly began to complain about various dishes that they did not like. For some reason, the concubine looked around and could not believe that there was not a single satisfied aristocrat. But Rebellia, unlike all the others, could absolutely calmly eat what was prepared on Aisha's command. However, she understood perfectly well the people who were afraid to even try this food, because visitors to Korea rarely ate it. It was about deliciously prepared rice dumplings and kimchi that no one liked. The fact that so much delicious food would simply go into the trash bin worried the first empress a little, and she thought about it. At this moment, the concubine still couldn't believe that she had failed so badly at her own event. Suddenly, Rebellia clapped her hands, addressing everyone at once, and said that she thanked the people for their visit. The concubine did not expect that the first empress would offer to prepare a simpler meal from the dishes she brought. No one present could believe that the lady was actually going to make something edible out of food that no one liked. The heroine was confident that she would succeed, but quickly noticed the reaction her words caused. The girl guessed that after Aisha's dishes, the aristocrats were distrustful of any innovations. When everything was ready, Rebellia did not know how exactly to persuade the nobility to try what had already been prepared on her orders. Suddenly, the ruler himself approached the empress and asked permission to be the first to choose a dish for himself. Alex noticed his wife's uncertainty and asked if she had any reason not to allow him to eat. He remarked that Rebellia's food would definitely not be as bad as the original, which Aisha heard and shrank even more. In response, the heroine told the emperor that she was only worried that his negative attitude might spoil the impression of the food, but His Majesty objected that he did not have the courage to try something truly disgusting. For some reason, these words made the first wife very angry, so she barely contained her emotions and told the guy to do as he wanted. Alex just smirked when he saw that the girl was visibly angry with him for some reason. As he passed the lady on his way to the table, the Emperor whispered to her that she had finally become the Robelia he knew. The Miss turned to follow the rules because she did not understand what he wanted to tell her by this. But despite her husband's words, the girl was still nervous since the Empire did not need ingredients, and she had to fantasize. But the heroine had lived in this world for a very short time, and therefore had not yet had time to learn the taste preferences of the inhabitants. So when Alex began to try her dishes, the Empress froze in excitement and stared at him. To her great relief, the Emperor suddenly announced to everyone that he thought the dish was quite good. The ruler then described to everyone present what it was about the food that he liked, which convinced the others to try it. Robelia herself exhaled and thought that it was not in vain that she watched various videos about food in her world. The aristocrats still stood aside and did not dare to try the new dishes, although they were noticeably interested. But the lady herself was no longer particularly interested in the opinions of others because Alex liked everything, and nothing else was important to her. Robelia didn't even think about expecting such a result, but in the end, she was very pleased with herself. At the same time, while giving advice to the chefs on how and what to cook, Miss replaced quite a lot of products from the original recipe. This is because the inhabitants of the Empire were used to eating other food, and in the end, they liked the new food so much that some even asked for more. The Empress stood at a distance from all the aristocrats in order to maintain the ability to observe everyone at once. At about this moment, the concubine left the hall in disgrace as she realized that nothing could be fixed. Because of the girl's actions, Robelia had to end the event, but Aisha clearly didn't care. As a reward for his efforts, Alex suddenly volunteered to accompany his first wife to her chambers, which alarmed the lady. She did not consider her merits at the end of the celebration sufficient to warrant thanking her too much. Here, the Emperor asked the girl not to be so vigilant and wary towards him. The guy tried to convince the lady that he helped her to the event, only because he really liked her food. Then Robelia admitted with a little embarrassment that she had indeed once been interested in cooking. To this, the ruler only smiled sweetly, since he did not even know that his wife was keeping such a secret. At that moment, the heroine observed Alex's behavior, and it seemed more and more strange to her. The thing is that the emperor from the novel and the emperor now in front of her were significantly different from each other. After all, in the book, the guy was a tyrant who only noticed one concubine, which is why Robelia died. Only now, when the miss held the ruler's hand, he did not seem cruel and merciless to her at all. Looking around, the miss thought that there was a high probability that the ruler simply had not yet developed feelings for Aisha. The girl was so immersed in her thoughts that she didn't even immediately notice where exactly the emperor had taken her. It turned out that in one place of the imperial garden, flowers had once grown that had been planted with the same name as the heroine. The guy explained that these plants were not grown before because they were poisonous, even though they were beautiful. Listening to all this, the heroine thought that she wanted to get to her bedroom, but somehow ended up here. So the lady asked the emperor if they really came here just to look at the flowers. To this, the ruler stated that he really enjoyed simply walking with his wife like this among the flowers in the imperial garden. Only Robelia reminded the guy that he had ignored her for 3 years before and now suddenly wanted to hang out together. The ruler looked at the girl and agreed that he had acted wrongly before and only now realized it. The lady, who had already managed to turn away from her husband, froze in place because she did not expect that he would suddenly ask for forgiveness. The girl's eyes widened in surprise, but she couldn't say anything yet. Deep in thought,